So, a voiced over item asylum video. I actually came up with this idea in the middle of playing a Juggernaut server, and the idea instantly got me interested since there are no videos that are like this. You read the title. This video will be about how to win in Juggernaut, as both the Juggernaut and the Survivor. And no, this is not a guide on how to play each Juggernaut. This will be about the general strategy you need in every Juggernaut server in order to win. For this video, I'll just have the average Juggernaut footage playing while I talk, but when I want to bring up a specific strategy, I'll show a corresponding clip on screen. So, let's begin with the strategies for the Juggernaut. As a Juggernaut, it's important to realize that you are against a usually full server, and that it's incredibly easy to feel overwhelmed. But if you can lock in and follow these strategies, you can usually win your round. The first strategy I have is to practice 2 to 3 Juggernauts and adopt them as your main. I typically see people complaining about not getting their main and then getting absolutely crushed as a result of picking something they aren't familiar with. It's very important to get more than one main, as it increases the chance of you getting something you know how to use. You can have a preference for a Juggernaut over the other, but practicing at length with at least 2 is very important. The more mains you have, the better off you'll be, though. So, adapt as many mains as you can, and sometimes it's a good idea to pick a Juggernaut that isn't your main on a public server just to get the gist of how you're supposed to play it, even if it results in a few losses. You're basically just ensuring in the future that something you know how to play appears more frequently rather than some garbage. I will say that 2 Juggernauts you should never main are Beta Figure and Mihawk. Both of them are garbage, one pretty good and one total trash, and there will always be people coming out of the woodworks to defend them and acting like they're the best Juggernauts, thinking they're unique for maining bad Juggernauts. While they can be used, it's just so much harder to win with them than any other Juggernaut. Mihawk is just flat out trash, but Beta is a slightly different case. If you can master its moves and practice really hard with it, you can win, but it takes significantly more effort to use Beta effectively than any other Juggernaut. Also, you will need to resort to move stacking on Beta, and for some reason it's allowed, but I personally would not recommend it. And no matter how good you are, if the survivors even get slightly above average RNG on a map that isn't Necromancer Arena, you lose. So, it's essentially putting in insane work while bug abusing in order to win as Beta, while you could be winning 50 times easier on other Juggernauts if you practice with them the same amount that you practice Beta. Most of the people who use Beta are 3,000 hour sweats who play the game religiously and think they're unique for maining a bad Juggernaut. That also applies to Mihawk as well, but Beta more so. Regardless, don't play Beta or Mihawk. Moving on, another tip that links into the previous one is to simply practice. More specifically, practice the keys required to activate moves on each Juggernaut without having to look at your keyboard. This is something that will naturally come with experience and is usually developed in public servers. This also gets more and more important regarding Juggernauts with lots of moves. My favorite Juggernaut personally is Vessel, and Vessel has the most moves. So it's important to know where each move is by muscle memory. Knowing, for example, 3+E activates the tendrils, and 2+ click activates the parry, really helps for your effectiveness in pumping out attacks. Next, and probably the second most important tip, is target prioritization. Most of the time, as the Juggernaut, you'll be swarmed by players attempting to melee you, with people standing at mid to long range attacking you with decent to pretty good ranged weapons, and it can be very tempting to attack all of the people rushing you and get them out of the way. However, the dude attacking you with Protest for 25 damage is usually just a cover-up for the guy using Intervention that's already chunked you for 400 health. If I had to summarize this tip as simply as possible, it's that the people in front of you are usually less important than the people further away. If you see someone using something like Tool Gun or Zapper, it's typically a good idea to go for them first, as ignoring hit scan weapons are automatically a way to lose. If you see bullets flying across your screen, rush down the person firing them so you can eliminate the biggest threats first. See this clip right here, for example. I see someone firing Tool Gun, and instead of going for the player closest to me, I swap targets and immediately target the guy who's doing the most damage to me. You'll be doing this a lot as you play rounds as Juggernaut, so it should be something to get used to. If you ignore the people with hit scan weapons, they're going to continue to pile up damage as the round goes on. The most important people to eliminate, though, are people that have curse stacking weapons. Items like Solemn Lament, Shadow Axe, and Sea Care are priority number 1 that you should kill as quickly as possible. Curse stacking can boost damage to around 3 times the original amount, so killing the person with Solemn Lament that's in front of you is usually a great way to prevent your entire health bar from disappearing. Items like loot are also an important thing to take care of, and is definitely easy to spot and kill because of the buff signs that connect each player to each other. Eventually, you'll run into someone with a mobility item and a good range, and for those situations, it is extremely frustrating. Depending on the item, you can sacrifice a bit of your HP to focus them down and kill them. But if they have an item like the Rot or Ashura Senku or something like Legion Kata, that's just extremely unlucky, and you'll have to try to either avoid them or catch them off guard if they get too close. Items that you should look out for are essentially any weapon that fires hit scan bullets, curse stacking items, loot, and summon spam using joy. You can typically ignore people with noob tube, but taking them out isn't a bad idea if you have no bigger targets to focus on. When you don't have a specific target in mind that you want to kill, it's usually good to default and focus down one person at a time and move on to the next, unless they have some sort of mobility item. If you're spam M1ing someone, you get them down to 10 health and move on to someone else without killing them, that person is just going to regenerate, and you've accomplished nothing. Sometimes you'll have to work extra hard in order to kill someone with items like Cloud and Bottle or Holy Mantle, but eliminating them first and foremost is good for your chances to win and your psyche. Your psyche during the middle of rounds is extremely important, as feeling overwhelmed usually just makes you make mistakes. It can be extremely frustrating seeing 3 people you target just use mobility items and get away, and depending on their item, it can be a good idea to either deal with them as quickly as possible or leave them be. The Rot is also an item you should deal with ASAP, as its dodges are extremely frustrating and can make you impatient if someone you're targeting just keeps dodging. Basically, the Rot is the #1 item you don't want survivors to have. Like I said earlier, target one person and move on to the next. Also, it goes without saying that Lilynet is also a must kill as soon as you can, but that's just a given. So, to summarize this tip, if you're targeting someone at close range, kill them. If you see someone spamming you with a hit scan weapon, drop everything and kill them. If you see someone curse stacking you, drop literally everything else and kill them. If you see someone with Lilynet or loot, kill them. If there are not any other obvious threats that you can see, you should be good to play normally and attack the people closest to you. Sadly, however, there will be times when the RNG of the survivors is simply too much to handle. This round is a great example of how you can be competent enough to always win, but the RNG can just get out of control. In this round, nearly every survivor got hit scan weapons with great utility weapons, something like counters, speed boosts, etc. 2 people got the Rot, which as I said earlier is the #1 worst items for the survivors to get, and almost everyone got hit scan weapons. Here are just some instances of me going to attack someone that's chunking my HP only to see them pull out a utility item and avoid getting hit. In these situations, when you get unlucky enough for everyone to have hit scans, going into the open is the worst thing to do, and picking out people who come close to you is the most important. However, when someone with some of these items runs away to the point where you have to sacrifice a few thousand of your health just to kill them, the round basically becomes unwinnable. Sometimes the people with hit scans are so far away on the bigger maps and have such good items that you literally cannot kill them without sacrificing basically all your health. In this clip, you can see me switching my attention to the people in front of me immediately to the people with the good weapons. But, as I said earlier, their utility items were just too good. Not to mention, this is on Crossroads, which is probably the second worst map in the game to be Juggernaut on. Moving on to the arguably most important tip, is to always keep track of where you are. This tip doesn't really apply to Necromancer Arena and other small maps, like Woodworks to an extent, but those maps are so Juggernaut friendly that it doesn't really matter, but basically every other map it does to some extent. Basically, do not fight people in the open. Typically, at the start of a round, people will come to you as you come to them. And it's important to realize that you have control of where the fighting is going on. So, what I'm saying is choose areas with obstacles around it that shield you from attacks from long ranges. In maps like Townie and Crossroads, it might seem impossible to win. However, staying in these corners can prevent attacks from long ranges and make people with powerful ranged weapons approach you to which you can deal with them easier. It may be tempting to chase people out into the open, but if you can kill them quickly, do it, and then immediately retreat back to the corner. This is also where good mobility items or utility items come into play and can really screw you over, but in those situations you just have to accept it and play as best as you can. Always remember that you have the advantage in close quarters, not everyone else. You will very quickly find that being in the center of Townie is much worse than being in the very corner right here, as people have to get much closer to attack you, and people with good range items are easier to spot. Here's an example of me following this advice. I'm consciously choosing to fight everyone in this corner so that the people with good range weapons have to get closer to me, and I immediately target the ones with better weapons to get them out of the way. This way the people cannot attack me from halfway across the map, or fully across the map. In this clip, I also bolt straight for the corner so I don't get peppered with hit scan items. Obviously, this round did not end up mattering because of the utility items that were simply too powerful, but this is still a good tactical play on my part that you should generally use. If you really want to be Juggernaut on specific maps, you can do that by turning off the Never Juggernaut option in settings and switching it back on when you get a map you like. Typically, the smaller the better. Maps like Critical Strike, Commencement, and Crossroads can basically feel impossible to win, while maps like Necromancer, Arena, and Woodworks are much easier to win on. However, sometimes the challenge of being Juggernaut in bad maps can really make you better at the game. Lastly, I just want to say that it's much easier to win Juggernaut now than it was before the Heat update. Most servers now get 16 players at all times, as opposed to 11 being the average. So, with 5 more players, it's significantly easier to get overwhelmed than it was before. So, to summarize general tips for Juggernauts: practice 2 to 3 Juggernauts and learn their abilities as keybinds by memory. Target the people with the best items instead of the ones in front of you, especially curse stackers. Never fight the main crowd in an open area, and don't get overwhelmed and try to remain totally calm. There are tons of guides on specific Juggernauts and how to play them, but I did not want to make a video like that since it's already done. Moving on to being a normal survivor, there is not much advice I have. First and foremost, it's good to know that you're typically out of control of how the match goes. It might sound confusing, but hear me out. The result of the round is almost always dictated by the skill of the Juggernaut. If a Juggernaut is great at the game, it's usually impossible to beat them, even if you get a great loadout a few times. Things will typically just work out for them, and you'll need substantially good items from your entire team to actually have a say in how the round goes. Very rarely does an elite player actually lose as Juggernaut because the game is in their hands, not yours. Obviously, this doesn't mean that you can't make a difference. If your entire lobby is filled with great players, then the team can try to make a stand, but still remember that the match is usually not in your hands. That doesn't mean you can't try and play with the cards you get dealt, though. Try as hard as possible and use your items to their fullest, regardless of how good they are. And if the Juggernaut isn't good enough, your team is mostly filled with competent players, and the RNG of your team as a whole is great, you can beat a skilled player when they're Juggernaut. If an unskilled player is Juggernaut, though, it's usually a free win. As a general rule of thumb, here are some signs that you're doing well in a round. Doing 100 to 300 damage to the Juggernaut is typically the bare minimum of performance. You aren't really doing your part to help the team. You'll have to rely on others. 400 to 600 damage is a decent contribution to your team, and if most of the lobby did that amount, you typically win. 700 to 900 damage is where you start to break into the significant contribution. If you consistently deal that amount of damage, you'll have a substantial chance of winning. Anything above 1000 damage is usually elite contribution, and your entire team usually has to be significantly worse than you in order to not win. Multiple people consistently reaching above 700 damage is a good sign that the server is significantly above average in skill. Servers like that are few and far between, and are very unlikely to have a Juggernaut victory, as the players are just simply more skilled. But still, the fate of the round is almost always in the Juggernaut's hands. Very rarely does the quality of the items and skill of the players make an impact on if the Juggernaut wins or loses, if they're good. After you realize that, the first real tip I have is to blend into the crowd as best you can. However, even this won't work against an experienced Juggernaut. If a Juggernaut is consistently targeting people away from the crowd, it can be a good idea to stick with the majority of people, if you have a good ranged weapon. Pulling out your ranged weapon, firing it, and then unequipping it can be a tool to confuse a Juggernaut regarding if you have a good weapon or not, and can lead to them not targeting you. If the Juggernaut does not follow the rules of target prioritization, you'll usually be free to sit back and spam your weapons at no risk to yourself, but always be wary of a Juggernaut targeting you. Sometimes they'll target you, damage you, and then stop attacking you. If that happens, that probably means that the Juggernaut is below average, and you can heal up and continue like normal and probably win. Once again, I will say that the fate of the round is not in your hands, and the Juggernaut can't just decide to kill you in like 5 seconds. So your best bet is to usually stall out for as long as possible, to jump on obstacles and whatever to waste their time, and allow for extra damage from your team. This would also be the point where you spam your utility items to piss off the Juggernaut as much as possible. The only tip that I have that can actually make a difference is to not follow the Juggernaut into close spaces if you can help it, and to try your absolute hardest to convince your team to stay in the center of the map with you. This is usually impossible for a normal team to follow though, as half your team will usually just rush in and not communicate. If you're playing Townie and the Juggernaut is solely staying in this corner, it's usually a sign that they know what they're doing. People will go for them, but it usually doesn't end well. People will still try to get into positions where they can use their ranged weapons, but the Juggernaut is able to see them better and pick their targets effectively. The best case scenario is that you and your entire team sit in the center of the map, waiting for the Juggernaut to come to you. If the Juggernaut is sticking to an enclosed space instead of running into the open, just know that they probably know what they're doing. And, once again, the fate of the match is not in your hands, but is entirely decided by the competence of the Juggernaut. Unless it's something like Beta or Mihawk, you basically get a free win. Of course, as I said earlier, try and play as optimally as possible with the items you have. If you have a good melee weapon, but an awful ranged weapon, it can sometimes be a good idea to rush in and do as much damage as possible while ultimately dying. And then you may get a good ranged weapon on your next life, and you can try to use it as optimally as possible. Depending on how good it is and how good the Juggernaut is, you can either be free to use it and get above 1000 damage, or watch the Juggernaut realize your threat and target you immediately. Regardless, always remember that if you lose, it's usually because you couldn't have done anything different. It's ultimately up to the Juggernaut. If a server is substantially below average in skill, then even mid-scale Juggernauts can win as well. If the entire server does not have a single person above 300 damage, that's usually a sign that the people are not the best, and that the Juggernaut victories are going to be more common than usual. But the majority of the script is assuming that a Juggernaut is above average in skill and semi-consistently win, while the item RNG is around average. The clip I described earlier is easily the worst RNG I've seen in any Juggernaut round, and is a perfect example of the RNG making a clear difference. I'm to the point, personally, where I can basically win 90% of my Juggernaut rounds when I play with General, Red Mist, or Vessel, so losing because of RNG is something that happens infrequently, but is definitely possible. In this situation, it was not entirely the skill of the players, it was basically their items. So that's not an example of the skill of the players making a real difference, but that is possible. So, to recap, as the Juggernaut, get 2 to 3 mains so you almost always get the ones you want to play, practice move keys from memory to use them optimally, target the biggest threats to yourself, usually hit scan ranged weapons, instead of the people in front of you. Always stay in more enclosed spaces where you are at less risk of hit scan weapons from across the map than you would be if you were in the center, and pray that the RNG of the survivors is not to the point where they all get utility items in good range. As a normal player, if the Juggernaut is targeting lone people, try to blend into the crowd. Don't be hasty to follow Juggernaut into enclosed space, and actively tell your team not to rush in guns blazing. Try your best to optimally play with the items given, and aim for at least 700 damage, and always remember that you have almost no control over how the round goes, and know that it is ultimately up to the skill of the Juggernaut whether you win or lose, but you should still try your best. Alright, we've reached the end. As I said earlier, I just wanted to provide a general strategy guide on how to win the Juggernaut mode from a strategic perspective, rather than giving basic overviews on how to play specific Juggernauts. That has been covered before, but I'm not sure if there are any videos that have covered everything like I have in this much detail. Most of the matches in the Juggernaut mode are won by the normal players, and it'd be interesting to see if the number of games won by Juggernauts goes up after this video is uploaded, if the video gets a good amount of views, of course. Anyway, this is the end of the video, and make sure to lock in during your next Juggernaut round and break the streak of losing Juggernauts. See you next time.
I absolve you of your sin. You have